In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning was Thought, and her name was Woman. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. She is the old woman who tends the fires of life. She is the old woman spider who weaves us together in a fabric of interconnection. She is the eldest God, the one who remembers. In the year of 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He discovered America. Then in 1620, the persecuted pilgrims, who had nowhere else to go, bravely set out across the sea and arrived in the promised land that God had prepared for them. They made friends with the Indians and had a beautiful Thanksgiving dinner together. In the 18th century, America's founding fathers created our nation, the most just and moral nation on earth. Then, in the 19th century, the courageous pioneers moved westward, claiming all of this empty land. When they encountered Indians, there was sometimes conflict because those violent Indians attacked them completely unprovoked. But the brave settlers persisted and settled all the land, building our beautiful country. Along the way, they helped the Indians by converting them to Christianity and sending their children to school. Under the crust of that portion of Earth called the United States of America, from California to the Gulf Stream waters, are interred the bones, villages, fields, and sacred objects of American Indians. They cry out for their stories to be heard through their descendants who carry the memories of how the country was founded and how it came to be as it is today. In the beginning, Anglo settlers organized irregular units to brutally attack and destroy unarmed Indigenous women, children, and old people, using unlimited violence in unrelenting attacks. Half of the 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children who were rounded up and force-marched in the dead of winter out of their country perished on the journey. The occupants of this land have always organized themselves as patriarchies. The founding fathers didn't include women in the Constitution, and women had to fight for over a century before men would give them the right to vote. Government, religion, business, law, medicine, all of these systems have always been patriarchal in this land. Finally, recently, we're making progress in ways that no culture has ever done before. Wait, what? The books I just read from are the Holy Bible, The Sacred Hoop, Recovering the Feminine in American Indian Traditions by Paula Gunn Allen, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and a silly amalgam of all the stuff that I learned as I was growing up. I highly recommend Ortiz's work for an overview of U.S. history, but today we're going to spend most of our time with Paula Gunn Allen, since we're going to be learning about gender. Paula Gunn Allen lived from 1939 until 2008 and was a member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe. In this book, she writes about the egalitarian, what she calls gynocratic, traditions of Native American cultures before European contact. While there were, and still are, hundreds of different cultures, languages, and peoples, all distinct from each other, with a wide variety of cultural practices, Allen writes that almost none of them were patriarchal. So what did they look like? Well, in Paula Gunn Allen's heritage culture, the Laguna Pueblo, their creation narrative says that In the beginning, Tse-che-nako, thought woman, finished everything, thoughts and the names of all things. She finished also all the languages. She says that this is a common theme among Indigenous American creation stories. Old Spider Woman is one name for this quintessential spirit. Serpent Woman is another. Corn Woman is one aspect of her. Earth Woman is another. The Hopi people's genatrix is called Hard Beings Woman, who created male and female humans by breathing life into them. In the creation story of the Seneca, Sky Woman is deposited on the back of Grandmother Turtle, upon whose shell all of Turtle Island is formed. Now, many cultures throughout history have included goddesses and even male and female co-creators in their religions, but that doesn't always translate into actual power in women's real lives. But Allen writes that in the case of most Indigenous American societies, women occupied prominent positions in the community that had decision-making power at every level of society. Wives directed husbands in selling items and making trades as often as husbands directed wives. Women tribal leaders attended councils and men deferred to them. In fact, when fur trader John Adair encountered the Cherokee in the late 18th century, he wrote that the Cherokee had been for a considerable while under petticoat government, and they were just emerging, like all of the Iroquoian Indians, from the matriarchal period. He was probably referring to the Women's Council of the Cherokee. The head of the council was the beloved woman of the nations, whose voice was considered that of the Great Spirit speaking through her. And the Iroquoian matriarchy that he was referring to, that's a fair description. Under the old laws, the Haudenosaunee were a mother-centered people whose political organization was based on the central authority of the matrons, the mothers of the longhouses, which meant all of the clans within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So what happened? If there were millions of people on this land with countless different cultures living in egalitarian social structures for centuries, where did they go? Why had I never heard about them before? Well, remember the chalice and the blade? This is another example of partnership cultures being ruthlessly attacked by a dominator culture that wanted to wipe them off the face of the earth. This dominator culture used many different strategies, but three of the main ones were, and in some ways this is ongoing today, extermination, or physical genocide, legislation, physical and cultural genocide, and forced conversion, cultural genocide. First, extermination. Again, read Dunbar-Ortiz's book for the details, but historians estimate that North America was home to 5 million people when Europeans arrived. By the end of the 19th century, only 238,000 remained. Most of these people were murdered in cold blood. And these massacres happened not only with the knowledge of the government, but often with its approval. And I want to say here that this wasn't like a different time when they didn't really know better. No, this was a few generations ago. People were using photographs and electric lights and telephones. Second, legislation. Some Americans who objected to the barbarity of outright massacres nevertheless still wanted the land, and so they supported legislation like the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Dawes Act of 1887. The Indian Removal Act was enforced so brutally as to cause upwards of 10,000 deaths as people were forced from their homes. And the Dawes Act split up Indigenous land into allotments and forced people into patriarchal nuclear farming families, separating them from their relatives, with the husbands as the heads of the home. This was an act of cultural genocide as it changed fundamental aspects of Indian life. And this is one way that gender norms were changed. Many communities who had practiced matrilineal partnership customs for innumerable centuries began to adopt patriarchy because of allotment. Third, forced conversion. As we know, the Europeans who came to the United States in the 17th century were religious zealots who even killed each other for not keeping their religious rules. Even in the 19th century, Americans tended toward religious extremism, thinking of themselves as God's chosen people who had a benevolent duty to save the savages from their heathen superstitions. Catholic and Protestant missionaries swept into Native communities with the explicit goal to wipe out their cultures and replace them with Christian ones, which would, among other things, drastically change gender norms. I talked with Dr. Sarah Hernandez, who is an enrolled member of the Sicangu Lakota Nation, to tell us about this process among the Oketi Sakowin, also known as the Great Sioux Nation.
Obviously, we always talk about settlers, right? But I really try and emphasize that it was Christian missionaries who were among the first settlers in Dakota Territory, and they really had a huge impact on colonization, right? As white Christian men, they had their own ideas about gender, they had their own ideas about who was in charge, as you were saying. And so all of this was established when the missionaries arrived, and they really forced this upon Dakota people. For instance, one of the things I mentioned in the book is that, traditionally treaties, women were our cultural and national leaders, right? Men always turned to the women for political advice, even signing these treaties. Missionaries didn't think that women needed to play any role in signing these treaties, and so they only dealt with the men. And so then women were suddenly excluded from this important leadership role in our society. So that would be one example. The missionaries thought that women needed to be domesticated. When missionaries began translating and transcribing our stories, suddenly they became the experts on our oral stories, displacing women from that traditional role they've always played as our oral storytellers. And one of the reasons that's so important is because those oral stories aren't just stories we tell each other for entertainment, right? Those stories are educational. They tell us our traditions and our values. And suddenly, women aren't telling those stories as much. It's these Christian men who are suddenly telling us how to behave, right? What's moral, what's immoral. And once they translated our stories, they were imposing Western values, right? These missionaries were white Christian men, and they had their own biases about women. They had their own ideas about what was immoral and what was moral. And they used literature to superimpose these ideas onto our stories so that we then begin to internalize some of these behaviors. And one of the things I talk about in this book is we see matriarchal patriarchal shift, right? We go from this primarily matriarchal society to this patriarchal society that is very much influenced by Western culture. And it all starts when these missionaries begin appropriating our stories and changing the meaning of those stories and changing the values and the lessons embedded in these stories.
Thank you so much, Sarah. There's some stuff for me to personally unpack here. In David Wallace Adams' book, Education for Extinction, he documents the stories of young, white Christian women who move out west to help Native American children by teaching them English and converting them to Christianity. This hit really close to home for me, as I remember being a very well-intentioned 21-year-old missionary teaching English and telling people to give up their way of life because I had been taught that mine was better and I was helping to save them. So let's get real for a minute. Any non-Native people watching this, what role do you think you would have played if you had been born in the 17th, 18th, 19th century? We all want to believe that we're good people and that we would never support a literal or cultural genocide. But those people thought that they were good people too. Their behavior made sense to them at the time, just like my mission made sense to me at the time. This program of extermination, legislation, and forced conversion through missionary efforts and boarding schools had devastating consequences for every aspect of Native life. It is an egregious crime against humanity, and we don't talk about it enough. However, another thing we don't talk about often enough is Native Americans' resistance and resilience. All along the way, Native peoples have fought back in every way imaginable, and their communities are still here, still doing powerful work. And because we focused on gender today, I want to highlight just a few Native women that you should know about and read, in addition to Paula Gunn Allen and Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. First, Dr. Sarah Hernandez, whom we just heard from. She wrote a book called We Are the Stars, Colonizing and Decolonizing the Oketi Sakowin Tradition. She talks about how missionaries mistranslated texts and how that changed culture and history. Second, if you're interested in Utah, you need to read Returning Home, Creative Works from the Intermountain Indian School by Diné scholar Dr. Farina King. She tells the story of a boarding school in Brigham City, Utah that operated from 1950 until 1984. And third, We Are Dancing for You, Native Feminisms and the Revitalization of Women's Coming-of-Age Ceremonies by Hupa, Karuk, and Yurok scholar Dr. Cutcha Risling Baldy. If you've heard of the gold rush in Northern California but have never learned about how it affected the people whose land it happened on, you need to read this book. It is so much worse than you think. But also, Dr. Baldy talks about initiatives to bring back the most beautiful and powerful coming-of-age ceremonies for girls. Ceremonies that were almost lost due to colonization, but that were remembered by their elders and reinstituted only in the last 20 years. And that brings us back to where we began today. In the beginning, the peoples of this land believed in Thought Woman and Corn Woman and Grandmother Spider and Grandmother Turtle. Creation and governing power were balanced, masculine and feminine. People honored women's votes and women's voices. Native Americans have endured unthinkable tragedy, but they're still here, and it's high time we knew their stories. All of us who live in this land have a responsibility to know what happened here and to do something to make it right. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like this video if you learned anything new. Then send it on to a friend who may not have had a chance to learn it yet. I also really appreciate comments. They help other people find my work.